those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves. Abraham Lincoln.
Oh hi, Mr. Lahasky here, and today we're called to discuss and to reckon with one of the most difficult topics in American history, unfree labor. To put it less gently, we're talking about slavery. Now, Americans did not invent unfree labor systems nor African slavery, but the institution evolved on the American continents into something more brutal and dehumanizing than other slave systems around the world. Slavery is America's original sin, and even today we struggle to contend with its remnants. Income inequality, the opportunity gap, mass incarceration, even the segregated neighborhoods of today's major cities, all of these phenomena can be traced back to this country's history of racially based forced labor systems. But before we begin, as we always do, let's start with a big question. Where does America's story begin? Historians are finders of facts and tellers of stories. The fact-finding process is a science. We analyze evidence and draw conclusions based on the patterns that we discover. Storytelling, on the other hand, is an art. Historians are constantly making decisions about how to interpret and retell the past. They have to decide where to start, where to end, what to include, and what to leave out. This is why history is constantly changing, as new evidence and developments give us reason to question existing interpretations. So, to tell America's story, one historian may choose to start in 8000 BC, when the First Nations settled the North and South American continents. Another might decide that the Declaration of Independence in 1776 is a more practical starting point. Yet another may choose 1492, when Christopher Columbus toppled a set of dominoes that led to the colonization of North America. All of these starting points could be acceptable places to begin our story. In 2019, journalists working in concert with the New York Times Magazine proposed a new interpretation, that the story of America really began in August of 1619, when a ship carrying more than 20 enslaved Africans arrived at Point Comfort, Virginia. They were the first of their kind in the British colonies. The 1619 Project argues that no aspect of the country that would be formed here has been untouched by the 250 years of slavery that followed. The journalism and scholarship of the project met wide acclaim, but like any historical interpretation, it's not gone unchallenged. Political partisans have accused the authors of rewriting history with an incendiary agenda. More moderate critics in academic circles suggest that the thesis exaggerates the role of slavery in American history. Ultimately, though, you should be the judge. Once armed with the facts, you can accept or reject the 1619 interpretation and decide when America's story truly begins. But your ultimate decision must be rooted in the evidence. So let's get started with our first big idea. Between 1500 and 1700, systems of unfree labor in the Americas underwent a transition towards African chattel slavery. Unfree labor refers to a labor system in which the worker is not free. He or she is bound by law to a job, piece of land, or an employer. In both the Spanish and British colonies, the first unfree labor systems did not use workers of African descent. But over time, the colonies transitioned to African slavery as their main source of unfree labor. In New Spain, we learned that the first iteration of unfree labor was defined by the encomienda system, wherein Spanish colonists enslaved Native Americans and forced them to work in the mines and plantations of the Spanish Empire. By the mid-1500s, however, two developments caused the Spanish to look elsewhere. First, Bartolomé de las Casas inspired debate over the morality of enslaving Native Americans, leading to the new laws of 1542 which outlawed the practice. Second, diseases like smallpox, carried to the Americas by Europeans, decimated native populations, with mortality rates as high as 90% in some areas. If the Spanish colonies were to survive, they needed a new labor source. Following the lead of the Portuguese, the Spanish began importing enslaved Africans to fill the void. In the British colonies, particularly in the Chesapeake and southern regions, unfree labor systems also transitioned to African slavery, but they didn't start that way. On Virginia's tobacco plantations, most of the work was originally done by white indentured servants from England. You'll remember that in 1617, the Virginia Company established the headright system, which awarded 50 acres of land to anyone who could pay their own passage from Europe, and another 50 acres for each additional worker whose passage they paid. Wealthy plantation owners, known as the planter aristocracy, were able to pay for many people to cross the Atlantic, and those migrants became the planters' indentured servants, obligated to work for a term of 3 to 7 years until the debt was paid and the servant was freed. Over time, however, cracks began to emerge in the indentured servitude system. The headright system created distinct socioeconomic classes. Rich members of the planter class were able to multiply their wealth, but for their labor in the colony, the indentures received nothing. If an indentured servant survived to the end of his service term, he was usually awarded a small tract of land along with his freedom. Unfortunately, the most fertile land in the Tidewater region had already been claimed by the planter aristocracy. This forced former indentures to the western reaches of the colony, where the land was far less fertile and where the colonists clashed with local Powhatan Indians defending their ancestral land. As time went on, the indentured servitude system produced a growing class of these poor western farmers who struggled to get by, while the planter class in the east continued to grow wealthier. This bred resentment among the Westerners, and the tensions reached a boiling point in 1676 with an event known as Bacon's Rebellion. In the 1670s, former indentured servants and other poor Western farmers appealed to the governor of Virginia, William Berkeley, to do more to protect them from Native American raids that were becoming increasingly common. Berkeley responded by raising taxes on these farmers, presumably to pay for a militia to defend them, but the militia never materialized and the colonists remained vulnerable. One of Berkeley's political rivals, Nathaniel Bacon, seized on the discontent of the Western farmers. In 1676, he rallied the farmers and marched them towards Jamestown to overthrow Berkeley by force. Facing a ragtag militia of around 500 Westerners, Governor Berkeley was actually forced to flee the colony. The mob then declared Bacon the new governor of Virginia. Unfortunately for the rebels, however, the insurrection was short-lived. Bacon died of dysentery, and Jamestown descended into chaos. The British Navy soon arrived to put down the rebellion and reinstate Berkeley as governor. Now, while Bacon's rebellion ultimately failed, it represents an important turning point in the British colonies. It illustrated, especially to the planter class, the fragility of the class system in Virginia, which had been defined by the institution of indentured servitude. The problems of indentured servitude caused the planter class to seek a form of unfree labor that would calcify the social hierarchy in the colony and still meet the economic needs of plantation agriculture. They found it in African slavery and never looked back. So why did enslaved Africans become the preferred source of unfree labor? The answer is our second big idea. The proliferation of African chattel slavery in the Americas had three main causes: the demands of cash crop economies, pre-existing slave infrastructure in Africa, and racism. Simply put, work in the colonies was extremely difficult. In the Chesapeake and southern British colonies, as well as the West Indies, plantation agriculture dominated economic activity. In fact, it was pretty much all they did. Tobacco was the main cash crop in Virginia and Maryland. Rice was widely grown in Georgia and South Carolina, and sugar was preferred in much of the Caribbean and South America. These crops were labor-intensive, and the climates were none too conducive to the long hours they required. Frankly, it was not work that many were willing to do for modest wages. But the plantations were simply not profitable otherwise. The explosion of tobacco and other cash crops drove prices down, shrinking the planters' margins. In order to stay ahead, they relied on unfree labor to work the fields. The entire colonial economy would have collapsed without it. So as a measure of self-preservation, the planter class endeavored to shape African slavery into the long-term labor solution that they needed to ensure their continued prosperity. When other unfree labor systems failed in the colonies, European colonists turned to Africa, in part because the slave trade infrastructure was already well established on that continent. In one form or another, slavery had been practiced in Africa for centuries, long before European exploration. Indentured servitude and serfdom were common in Africa as in Europe. Often, the enslaved were criminals or prisoners of war. When the Portuguese began to explore and colonize Africa in the early 1400s, they traded weapons and other metalworks to African kingdoms in exchange for enslaved people. To maintain these trade relationships and to outfit their own armies, African kings and traders expanded their slave-catching operations and competed with one another for the business of the Portuguese. Later, when Spanish and English unfree labor systems in the New World faltered, they followed the Portuguese to Africa, where they encountered a robust market for the labor they sought. The ensuing Atlantic slave trade, defined by the brutal Middle Passage, devastated the African continent. For a little more on how this system developed, check out this TED-Ed clip.
Slavery, the treatment of human beings as property, deprived of personal rights, has occurred in many forms throughout the world. But one institution stands out for both its global scale and its lasting legacy. The Atlantic slave trade, occurring from the late 15th to the mid-19th century and spanning 3 continents, forcibly brought more than 10 million Africans to the Americas. The impact it would leave affected not only these slaves and their descendants, but the economies and histories of large parts of the world. There had been centuries of contact between Europe and Africa via the Mediterranean. But the Atlantic slave trade began in the late 1400s with Portuguese colonies in West Africa and Spanish settlement of the Americas shortly after. The crops grown in the new colonies, sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton, were labor-intensive, and there were not enough settlers or indentured servants to cultivate all the new land. American natives were enslaved, but many died from new diseases, while others effectively resisted. And so, to meet the massive demand for labor, the Europeans looked to Africa. African slavery had existed for centuries in various forms. Some slaves were indentured servants, with a limited term and the chance to buy one's freedom. Others were more like European serfs. In some societies, slaves could be part of a master's family, own land, and even rise to positions of power. But when white captains came offering manufactured goods, weapons, and rum for slaves, African kings and merchants had little reason to hesitate. They viewed the people they sold not as fellow Africans, but criminals, debtors, or prisoners of war from rival tribes. By selling them, kings enriched their own realms and strengthened them against neighboring enemies. African kingdoms prospered from the slave trade, but meeting the Europeans' massive demand created intense competition. Slavery replaced other criminal sentences, and capturing slaves became a motivation for war rather than its result. To defend themselves from slave raids, neighboring kingdoms needed European firearms, which they also bought with slaves. The slave trade had become an arms race, altering societies and economies across the continent. As for the slaves themselves, they faced unimaginable brutality. After being marched to slave forts on the coast, shaved to prevent lice, and branded, they were loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. About 20% of them would never see land again. Most captains of the day were tight packers, cramming as many men as possible below deck. While the lack of sanitation caused many to die of disease and others were thrown overboard for being sick or as discipline, the captains ensured their profits by cutting off slaves' ears as proof of purchase. Some captives took matters into their own hands. Many inland Africans had never seen whites before and thought them to be cannibals, constantly taking people away and returning for more. Afraid of being eaten, or just to avoid further suffering, they committed suicide or starved themselves, believing that in death their souls would return home. Those who survived were completely dehumanized, treated as mere cargo. Women and children were kept above deck and abused by the crew, while the men were made to perform dances in order to keep them exercised and curb rebellion. What happened to those Africans who reached the New World, and how the legacy of slavery still affects their descendants today, is fairly well known. But what is not often discussed is the effect that the Atlantic slave trade had on Africa's future. Not only did the continent lose tens of millions of its able-bodied population, but because most of the slaves taken were men, the long-term demographic effect was even greater. When the slave trade was finally outlawed in the Americas and Europe, the African kingdoms whose economies it had come to dominate collapsed, leaving them open to conquest and colonization. And the increased competition and influx of European weapons fueled warfare and instability that continues to this day. The Atlantic slave trade also contributed to the development of racist ideology. Most African slavery had no deeper reason than legal punishment or intertribal warfare, but the Europeans who preached a universal religion and who had long ago outlawed enslaving fellow Christians needed justification for a practice so obviously at odds with their ideals of equality. So they claimed that Africans were biologically inferior and destined to be slaves, making great efforts to justify this theory. Thus, slavery in Europe and the Americas acquired a racial basis, making it impossible for slaves and their future descendants to attain equal status in society. In all of these ways, the Atlantic slave trade was an injustice on a massive scale, whose impact has continued long after its abolition.
Indeed, the demand for labor in the colonies and the available supply in Africa drove American colonists to expand slavery in the New World. But we cannot discount the role of race and racism in this expansion. Europeans of the late Middle Ages and Enlightenment often turned to racist beliefs to justify the conquest and oppression of outside groups. To justify their conquest of Ireland in the 12th century, the English launched a campaign to characterize the Irish as a savage, bestial race. In order to justify the persecution and execution of Jews in the 13th century, Europeans vilified Jewish people as cannibalistic and subhuman. Similar distinctions against Africans emerged as the atrocities of the Atlantic slave trade became known. Whiteness became an accepted measure of superiority in Europe. Once in the colonies, race was again used to crystallize a labor system that depended on unfree workers. The first African slaves in Virginia were treated like indentured servants. They served a finite term and could even earn their freedom by converting to Christianity. But remember, plantation owners in southern colonies wanted to avoid the pitfalls of indentured servitude, so they used race to transform the institution of slavery. Throughout the 1600s, the Chesapeake and southern colonies passed slave codes, colonial laws that transformed African slavery into something that was uniquely American. These slave codes racialized unfree labor in the New World, declaring that enslavement was a lifelong condition, passed through the mother. Not only did this solve the planters' problem of indentured servants only being temporary workers, it also justified and even encouraged the forced breeding and rape of enslaved women, for their children became slaves for life to the mother's owner. Other slave codes outlawed slave education and marriage, permitted enslavers to physically punish their workers, and rendered slaves legal property. White colonists systematically attempted to dehumanize the African race in order to preserve their social and economic position in colonial society. While slavery was practiced in all 13 British colonies, it was concentrated in the South, where plantation agriculture was ubiquitous. There, a distinct slave culture emerged, which brings us to our third and final big idea. Enslaved people resisted the inhumanity of their condition in covert and overt ways. In 2018, Kanye West, that Kanye West, faced criticism for remarks in a TMZ interview and subsequent tweets in which he implied that enslavement was a choice and that enslaved people did little to resist their condition. This, of course, is untrue. Subject to unbearable conditions and stripped of all dignity, enslaved people use a myriad of strategies to resist their captors and protest the inhumanity of the institution. Covert methods of resistance were often preferred. Many aspects of slave culture were designed to foster hope, support, and humanity within the community. There are several examples of this. The first is fictive kinship. Often, enslaved families were separated on the auction block. On the plantation, slaves turned to fictive kinship. Fictive kinship was the process of establishing makeshift family units with others on the plantation. While not related by blood, these kinships aimed to recreate the support systems and sense of community that the enslavers had taken away. Slave marriages were a common method of retaining a sense of humanity, even though those unions were not recognized by white colonists and had no legal standing. Religion and spirituality also allowed for enslaved people to resist dehumanization. Many enslaved communities adopted some form of Christianity, and it's not hard to see why they would identify with many of the stories found in the Bible. Black preachers focused on the Old Testament's promise of freedom and the New Testament's promise of salvation, and the stories kept the community looking towards the future with hope. Music was also central to slave culture. The African American spiritual was a genre that sprung from the plantation, and combined these religious messages with descriptions and realities of slave life. Here's one you may have heard before, but try hearing it from the perspective of those who sang it first. All of these expressions of culture and humanity were indeed aspects of protest against the institution of slavery, an institution that attempted to strip its victims of the dignity to which all people are entitled. Enslaved people in the New World also used more overt forms of protest, but they did so at great risk to themselves and their families. One of the common overt forms of protest were work slowdowns, intended to hurt the plantation's profits. This was often accomplished by breaking necessary tools and equipment provided by the plantation owner. Some enslaved people protested their condition by attempting escape, but this was not as common as you might think. Remember, plantations in the South were large and spread out. It was difficult to survive in the harsh climate and terrain. Many runaways who weren't caught died of exposure. Even more problematic, there was no real place of refuge in the Americas until the North began abolishing slavery in the late 1700s. But the thing that most often kept enslaved people from running away were family ties. Whether related by blood or through fictive kinship, Family was paramount in slave communities. And while escaping alone was difficult, escaping with a family was near impossible. Leaving family members behind also exposed those members to retribution from the plantation owners. So it was a course of action unavailable to most enslaved people. The rarest form of resistance, but certainly the most overt, were slave revolts. These were plantation owners' biggest fear, but rarely occurred. The most noteworthy example is the 1739 Stono Rebellion in South Carolina. While revolting slaves were able to do significant damage and even kill many of their captors, white retribution was swift and brutal. The disproportionate violence against slaves that followed a revolt was designed to strike fear into the community, and it often worked. So ultimately, Kanye's implication falls flat. Even in places where blacks outnumbered their enslavers, options were limited. Nonetheless, generations of enslaved people found ways to resist their oppression. And the centuries of resistance were critical to the institution's ultimate demise. Of course, that'll be a story for another day. But speaking of stories, let's circle back to the big question. Where does America's story begin? Does it truly begin on the shores of Virginia with the arrival of the first enslaved Africans? This too will need to be revisited later. We'll continue this discussion throughout the year by tracing the impact of slavery on the direction and development of the United States. Whether or not you ultimately agree with the thesis of the 1619 Project, this much is certain. We cannot tell America's story honestly without confronting the role that slavery plays in that story. And we will never overcome the mistakes of the past without looking them square in the eye. I'll leave you today with one of my favorite African American spiritual arrangements, which tells the story of Ezekiel, who happens upon an angel preparing a chariot that he hopes will carry him to freedom. Next time, we'll look to the north and to the New England colonies. See you then.
Ezekiel looked out in the middle of the field. He saw an angel working on a chariot wheel. He wasn't so particular about working on the wheel. He just wanted to see how the chariot feels. How the chariot feels. Swing down, sweet chariots up and let me ride. Swing down, chariots up and let me ride. Oh, rock me, Lord, come and easy. I got home on the other side. Why don't you swing down, sweet chariots up and let me ride? Swing down, chariots up and let me ride. Oh, rock me, Lord, come and easy. Oh, I got home on the other side. Well, Ezekiel looked out as he got on board. He saw the chariot bumping on down the road. He wasn't so particular about bumping down the